Shavua Tov Rabotai. We're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Terumot. We're up to Perek Tet Mishnah Daled. Today's Mishnah should be Nishmat Neria ben Tzvedlan Aran Bayev and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden Amen. The Mishnah is going to give us today another ruling about the growths of Terumah. The Mishnah says Gidulei Terumah. The growths of Terumah are treated as Terumah. The Gidulei Gidulin Chulin. But the growths of these growths are ordinary non-Terumah produce, which is permitted to everyone once it has been tied. And Mepharshim explain that the Isur D'Rabbanan, the rabbinic prohibition against eating Terumah growths, applies only to that which grew from seeds of actual Terumah. But if the seeds of Terumah growths are planted, their growths are not treated as Terumah, but rather as Tevel, just like any other ordinary produce. And the Yerushalmi, the Mepharshim bring down the Yerushalmi that says this leniency is limited to plants like wheat and barley, whose seeds decay when planted with entirely new plants growing in their place. But in regards to species like an onion, whose seed is a bulb, which doesn't decay but expands and gives rise to a new bulb, even the growths of the growths are going to be forbidden. Now, just like we explained in Mishnah 1, growths of Terumah are forbidden midrabanan to non-kohanim. The rabbis prohibited to growths of Terumah to non-kohanim to eat. However, the growths of other types of forbidden produce are permitted even midrabanan. The Mishnah tells us, aval tevel, if someone planted tevel, and the Mepharshim explain, tevel we know is produce that was grown in Eretz Israel that you did not remove any of the tithes. One is allowed to eat tevel in a casual manner as a snack and not as a meal until it is fully processed. After its processing, however, one may not eat it at all before tithing it. So our Mishnah is teaching that if someone planted tevel that has been fully processed, which cannot be eaten at all, its growth do not carry this restriction. Rather, like other newly grown produce, they may be eaten casually until their own processing has been completed. Now, the Mepharshim do point out that although the other Mepharshim write that the completion of processing is what makes it produce prohibited for snacking, that's only if the owner intends to sell it. In the case of produce that the owner intends to eat it, snacking is permitted until he brings it into his house or courtyard. Right? That's we're going to see this in Masechet Masrot, chapter 1, Mishnah 5, that the only time completion of processing is going to make the produce prohibited for snacking is if the owner wants to sell. But if the owner wants to eat it, snacking would be permitted until he brings it into his house or courtyard. Now, the Rav says, why is the Mishnah telling me tevel? Because you could have thought that the growths of tevel are similar to the growths of terumah, which under rabbinic law midrabanan are forbidden like the seeds from which they grew. So the Mishnah is telling us that tevel growths are not forbidden once they are tithed. And the reason the Chachamim dealt more leniently with tevel than terumah is because unlike terumah, tevel is mostly chulin, meaning after the required terumot or masrot were removed from tevel, the remaining produce, which consists of most of the crop, is chulin. And the Mepharshim say this again is limited only to plants of tevel, which seeds decompose in the ground. But if the planted tevel has seeds like onion bulbs that do not decay when planted, its growths and even the growths of its growths may not be eaten at all, since the original bulb is still original forbidden bulb is still present. The Mishnah continues, Umaser Rishon, or Maser Rishon is Terumat Maser, has not been separated. We know Maser Rishon is a 10% that's given to the Levi, but the Levi also has to separate 10% for the Kohen. So Maser Rishon, from which Terumat Maser has not yet been separated, is Tevel. This Tevel cannot be eaten at all, even casually, because Maser Rishon, like every other tithe, is separated after the produce has been processed. So if one planted it, the growths are not going to be subject to this Isur D'Rabbanan. They can be eaten casually until their own processing has been completed. And the reason the Chachamim dealt leniently with this tevel, again, more leniently than terumah, is because it's mostly chulin, meaning once the terumat maser has been removed from the maser rishon, the remaining 9/10 are always chulin. And the Mishnah continues, Svichei Shvi'it, or Svichin of Shemitah. Svichin are aftergrowths. They're plants that grew on their own during Shemitah from seeds that fell during the previous year's harvest. Now, although Svichin cannot be eaten midrabanan, they're allowed to be eaten biblically, but the rabbis prohibited eating Svichin. The Mishnah teaches that if somebody planted Svichin, the growths would be permitted even rabbinically, and the reason the Chachamim didn't prohibit the growths of Svichin is because Svichin are relatively rare, and on top of that, the prohibition of Svichin applies only once every 7 years, and we know as a rule, the Chachamim did not make decrees regarding situations that are uncommon. And the Mishnah continues with Terumat Chutz La'aretz, or the Terumah, produce that grew outside of Eretz Yisrael. We know biblically the obligation of Terumah and Maaser apply only to produce that grew in Eretz Yisrael, but the Chachamim extended them to nearby countries, Egypt, Ammon, Moab, Bavel, Babylonia. So if one were to plant Terumah separated from the produce of those countries, the growths will be permitted even midrabanan, and the reason the Chachamim didn't prohibit them is because Terumah is relatively uncommon in those countries where most of the landowners were not Jewish, and the Mishnah continues, Vamiduma, or Miduma, which is a forbidden mixture of Terumah and Chulin. The sages didn't include growths of Miduma in their prohibition against growths of Terumah, because Miduma is mostly Chulin, but Bikurim or Bikurim, we know are the first fruits to ripen from each of the 7 species for which the Torah praises Eretz Yisrael, which is wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. They're brought by the owner to the Bet HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, like we know in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 26, Psukim 1-11. So these fruits, which are known as Bikurim, they have the same sanctity as Terumah. After being brought to the Bet HaMikdash, they're given to a Kohen who has to eat them in Yerushalayim. So the Chachamim, they didn't include growths of Bikurim in their decree against growths of Terumah, because since Bikurim are limited to the 7 species, they're not as common as Terumah. The Mishnah says, Gidulei and Chulin, their growths are ordinary produce, after which tithes is permitted to everyone. So just as a recap to say it, all of them in once, Tevel, Maaser Rishon, Slichei Shvi'i, Terumat Chutz La'aretz, Miduma, and Bikurim, their growths are ordinary produce, which after it has been tithed is permitted to everybody. Gidulei Hekdesh and Maaser Sheni Chulin, the growths of Hekdesh and Maaser Sheni are also Chulin, but they have to be redeemed. And the Mefarshim explained the Chachamim didn't decree that the growths of Hekdesh and Maaser Sheni are subject to the prohibition of the original produce, because although Maaser Sheni cannot be eaten when it's tameh, they were not concerned that if it becomes tameh, the owner might keep it until he can plant it, which opens up the risk of eating it illegally in the meantime. Because since the owner can redeem it instead and use it right away, which is an option that doesn't exist with Terumah, he would do that rather than wait until the planting season, and therefore there was no need to make a decree that would deter someone from planting Maaser Sheni when he could just redeem it, and the same would apply to Hekdesh, which is similar to Maaser Sheni. And the Rav points out the growths of Hekdesh and Maaser Sheni are Chulin, even if they grew from a bulb that doesn't decompose when planted, because in this regard they are unlike the growths of Terumah. They are unlike the growths of Terumah and the other items that we listed above, which are permitted only if they came from a seed that decomposed. And the Mishnah says, "Upodeh otam bisman zaram," though one may redeem them from what they are worth at the time of their planting, even though they are now worth far more. And the Mefarshim explain, although the new growths are chulin, one is still rabbinically obligated to redeem them. However, the entire crop can be redeemed for the price of the original hekdesh or maaser sheni that was planted. For example, if someone planted 1 se'ah of grain that's hekdesh or maaser sheni and he yielded 10 se'ah, he can redeem the 10 se'ah for the price of 1 se'ah, which is what the Mishnah said. Upodeh otam bisman zaram, or you can redeem them for what they were worth at the time of their planting, even though now they're worth far more. And that is in Rabotai Mishnah Daled. Mishnah Hey now discusses the seeds of most species of plants decay in the ground, and entirely new plants grow in their place. However, there are some species, like we said, onion, whose seed is a bulb, which doesn't decay, but expands and gives rise to new bulbs. So the Mishnah now is going to draw a halachic distinction between the two types of produce with respect to the laws of planted terumah. If 100 rows of terumah and 1 row of chulin were planted in a field and it's not known which row is chulin, kulan mutarin b'tevar shezarov kaleh. All the rows are permitted to non-kohanim in the case of species whose seed decomposes in the ground, because since the seed has decayed and no part of the original terumah is still present in the new growths, the Chachamim ruled leniently and they permitted the produce in all of the rows, even though most of the rows were planted with terumah. And the Rab explains, when the Chachamim decreed that terumah growths are forbidden, they included a special leniency in the decree, meaning that the presence of just a single unidentified row of chulin prevents the entire field from being prohibited. However, the Mishnah is telling us this leniency is specific to species whose seed decomposes when planted. But in the case of species whose seed doesn't decompose, like onion, even if it was the opposite case, 100 rows of chulin and 1 row of terumah, all the rows are forbidden to non-kohanim because part of the original terumah is still present. And the Farshim explain the rabbis treated species whose seeds remain in existence more stringently than species whose seeds decompose, meaning they didn't apply this special leniency above, that if you have 1 row of chulin growths, they can make 100 row of terumah growths permitted. Rather, even if it's the exact opposite, there's 100 rows of chulin and one row of terumah. Each row is prohibited because it might be the single row of terumah. Now, although we know terumah is usually nullified in a mixture that contains 100 times more, as much as the chulin, like we learned in chapter 4, Mishnah 7, that's not true in this case when the terumah and the chulin are still attached to the ground. Now, since each row of produce stands on its own parcel of land, the terumah rows and chulin rows are not considered mixed. Therefore, there is no nullification process being done. That is then, Rabotai, today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.